show is very much what I see on the ground in communities throughout America, Jim, which is the average American household has income of $32,000 a year. They have expenses of $37,000 a year, and they finance that $5,000 a year deficit with liquidating assets, working harder, or borrowing more. And, of course, as you know, and it's clear from your website, the debt has gone, not just the consumer debt has gone up, but the mortgage bubble has gone up. And we've now, that load is just increasing every year. And meantime, we are accelerating moving all the jobs and income abroad. Now, when you move all your income abroad and you leave your growing debt at home, it doesn't take long to understand what's going to happen to a Fannie Mae, a Freddie Mac, or a Ginnie Mae. At some point, the growing debt has got to get serviced, and the question is, how? You can flood the country with immigrants who can buy up real estate that you finance at the bottom, but at some point, something's got to give in the middle. I mean, if you shrink and collapse the middle class, they're going to default on their mortgages.
You would think, Catherine, though, given the size of this credit bubble that we're creating, not only in mortgages and the bond market, the proliferation of hedge funds that literally move large amounts of money in and out of the market, people would be paying more attention to debt. But I hear stories that you get these people on Wall Street that say we have no inflation, and the other side of that story is as long as the Fed raises interest rates at a measured pace, the stock market will continue to go up and consumers will continue to spend money. None of that makes sense to me.
It makes no sense unless let me give you an example. Last year we appropriated $87 billion for Iraq, but the administration has repeatedly said it can't explain where half of that money is going. It was interesting. One of the top reporters who's followed the $3.3 trillion of missing money, I asked them the other day, I said, where do you think the $87 billion went to? And they said, oh, we think it financed the state deficits, because all of a sudden they were screaming about the state deficits and then all of a sudden it stopped. We've had a complete implosion of internal financial controls in the governmental apparatus. I mean, $3.3 trillion missing from government is a financial coup d'etat. You can keep a bubble going as long as you can finance it. And my guess is, again, very much credit to Bill Murphy, what we're watching is a securities operation both with the federal agencies, the mortgage agencies, and the U.S. Treasury, which are financing a political economy. The money that comes in from those debt operations are being used for their lawful purposes. Here's the question. If we're manipulating the gold market, who's financing that? Who's financing the money that it costs to manipulate the gold market? Well, if $2.3 trillion is missing in a year, that's plenty enough to manipulate the gold market and a lot of other markets.
You would think, though, Catherine, and this is why I just wonder if we're coming up against some headwinds here, because certainly, even though you can manipulate markets, you can bring interest rates down, you can keep asset prices inflated. But let's bring this back down to, let's say, Main Street. You've driven around looking at these communities. If people are losing their jobs, if the jobs are going overseas, if they're downsized, where they're not making the same kind of income that they used to make, let's say, 5, 10, 15 years ago, they're adding more debt. Even though that debt is at a lower interest rate, there comes a point where you can't get any more debt. Nobody wants to give you another credit card, or the bank simply will not give you another home equity loan. I mean,
right.
At some point you run up against a wall.
Right, and that's where we are. I'm in Washington, D.C. today, but I live in Hickory Valley, Tennessee. In western Tennessee, in many of the communities, we're in a state of depression. I mean, the middle class is essentially being wiped out. And you're absolutely right, without fundamental productivity in the economy, there can be no economic gains. Now, you can get some economic gains by moving in lots of immigrants. I mean, my impression, Jim, is that the borders are open and America's experiencing very rapid immigration. And that's part of what's keeping the economy pumped up. You can also keep activity going with, as long as you can finance the U.S. economy by borrowing more money and printing more dollars and pushing more dollars out. But we've reached a point where immigration and warfare are two economic activities after a bubble. But what we've been watching for years in this country is very significant falling productivity. Now, I'll give you another example, which is kind of a bugaboo of mine. My understanding is there's approximately 75 million people in America taking Prozac or psychotropic drugs. Well, you can't be a productive economy if everybody is, between illegal narcotics, psychotropic drugs, and alcohol. If everybody's eating unhealthy food and taking drugs, they cannot be productive.
Explain the productivity miracle that Greenspan trumpets every time he's on Capitol Hill.
We're running the economy to centralize wealth. We're using what I call a negative return on investment governmental apparatus, both the budget and the credit and regulation, to centralize bank deposits, centralize purchases, centralize investments. We're centralizing political and economic power. And in the process of that, we're doing not what I call privatization. Privatization is when you transfer government assets to private investors at market price. Privatization is when you transfer government assets to private investors at significantly below market prices. So we're going through a process of using the governmental apparatus to centralize economic power and wealth in a way that shrinks the total pie. And Greenspan's job is to put a pretty face on that. And the mortgage bubble's job is and the U.S. Treasury securities fraud is to finance that. So it's good for Greenspan, it's good for the people he works for, it's terrible for the economy, and it's certainly terrible for people like you and me. An honest finance guy is at a huge disadvantage in this environment.
It almost seems like we're turning the population in the U.S. into economic serfs because you take a two-income family today between what it costs to buy a house, make a couple and own two cars, make payments, and send your kids to school. There's nothing left over.
Well, think about it this way. Another way to look at it is, say the average taxes per resident is about $5,000, and 85% of that, or say $4,700, is going to agencies who refuse to produce audited financial statements or reliable financial systems. And if you study the black budget, increasingly what you're seeing is that money is going to support private corporations and private banks who are using those resources to basically steal community assets out from under them. So you're basically financing an operation which is stealing all your political powers and economic wealth. It's a drain.
Yeah, what this is a giant wealth transfer. And I remember it
right.
was Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, because most couples today, as you just pointed out, 75 million Americans are taking some form of Prozac or another. That tells you that a lot of that, I suspect, is coming from depression and economic stress.
Right. I think a lot of it is. Now, but let's talk about where the opportunity is, because I think the way to solve any problem is to make money solving it, which will show you my investment banking prejudice. The secret in all of this, and you see it when you start to really study what's happening in the mortgage bubble, is that if you draw a circle around your place, for example, San Diego, what you'll find is the federal, state, and local government money has a negative return on investment. At the same time, you have tremendous amounts of small business income and small real estate income that's not securitized in the equity market. So you've got billions of dollars of income, which is, in essence, trading at a multiple of 1 to 5 times because it's owned by illiquid entities, whereas it could be securitized at 20 to 30 times if it was trading through a liquid security. My company, Solari, which is an investment advisor, is still in formation. What we want to do is help communities essentially securitize the small business income in their places, which is a way of liquefying that money and creating the equity securities and equity clout they need to start doing a series of things. One is privatizing. I mean, why do we need a big corporation to come in and privatize our water? Why don't we just privatize our water, create a liquid security, and get the capital gains for ourselves? When I mentioned before, when I became Assistant Secretary of Housing, there were neighborhoods where all the federal agencies owned 70% of the mortgages in that town because that was how many mortgages were in default. And the community would tell me, Jim, well, we don't have enough money to buy all our defaulted mortgages. And I said, well, don't be ridiculous. Start a venture fund and swap us equity for the debt. So just create an entity, create securities, do a debt for equity swap. So I